But I really want to focus on Chris Kvartek here. You know, one of the big breakout stars in 2019, was the Rookie of the Year then. And, you know, he's actually choosing to play a slightly different build of Temur Adventures here. As you can see, he had, you keep seeing copies of the Great Henge. And it's because he's not playing the 2, which is typical in most of these versions. He's playing the full 4. He's choosing not to play Obosh, playing more creatures instead, and choosing to play the full 4 copies of the Great Henge instead of a card that is a 4 of in most of these decks, Alrund's Epiphany.
Oh, interesting. So he's all in on the henge, and we'll see if that pays off for him. We also notice that in his list, he's clearly had a few nods towards this exact matchup, perhaps anticipating that Sultai Ultimatum would be the most popular deck. He's included some negates and disdainful strokes in the main there, Paul, to help fight off these pesky 7-mana bombs that Reid's going to try to cast here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is the benefit of not having to play Obosh. Obosh makes it so you only can play odd casted cards in your deck, so you don't get to play those hard counters, those 2-mana counters, and instead you have to go for slightly other less efficient options, cards like Saw It Coming, which, you know, either cost a total of 4 mana if you do choose to foretell it, or 3 mana, which is a lot easier to play around.
You know, on the other side of the table here for Reid, we noticed when we were looking at the deck list earlier that Reid seems to have positioned himself for the same thing, by the way, that Chris Kvartek did, and anticipating seeing a lot of, in his case, the mirror match from Sultai Ultimatum. How's that going to affect his chances here against Chris's build, which of Temur Adventures, which, you know, it can be a lot more assertive than Sultai can be?
It can be, but when you think about the decks that you need to kind of be mindful of in terms of the aggressive strategies in the format, this isn't really the deck that you're that scared of, because the Temur Adventure deck really functions as more of a mid-range deck. And I feel that basically any version of this Sultai Ultimatum deck will have enough answers in general. So I think specifically in this matchup, you know, Reid did choose to play, for example, 4 copies of Mazemind Tome, which is really, really bad against aggressive strategies. But in this specific matchup, I don't think it's going to punish him as much.
Well, Reid finds a little window here to take care of the Edgewall Innkeeper on end step, untap, and then play Cultivate before passing the turn back. And all Chris can do is follow up with the Lovestruck Beast that was on an adventure. It's going to sit on the battlefield here, but now back to Reid, and he's going to have access to 5 mana here.
Yeah, and Chris missed a very crucial land drop that prevented him from being able to play that Lovestruck Beast on turn 3. And now he still needs to find a land for the Great Henge, but I mean, Reid has been able to just kind of deal with everything right now. He's going to be able to go Omen of the Sea here, foretell Alrund's Epiphany, and then play that Epiphany on the following turn, and Chris doesn't have any counters for it. Now, Reid doesn't have the very powerful sorcery that this deck is named after in the Immersion Ultimatum, so he's going to need to find something like that to try to close out the game. Really big note here is that he's only actually playing 3 copies of Immersion Ultimatum, which is something that you basically almost never see.
Sacrilege, you know, when you're going to play a deck called Sultai Ultimatum. Now, Reid ends up going 1 on the bottom, 1 on the top there with the main phase Omen of the Sea. He ended up getting Binding of the Old Gods into hand, but his only follow-up here is land drop plus foretell Alrund's Epiphany pass. So he is going to take a decent chunk of damage here, and Kvartek puts his hands together and says, please, please, please. And unfortunately for him, he can't find the land he needs. He finds Edgewall Innkeeper instead.
Yeah, Sultai Mazemind Tome just doesn't have as good of a ring to it. So I think you still have to kind of go with Sultai Ultimatum, but yeah.
That's good. But in this case, that actually would be more accurate. Reid's running 4 Mazemind Tome in the main deck and only 3 of the Ultimatum. So see where you're going with it.
And if you notice there, Chris choosing not to play the Edgewall Innkeeper there, what he really wants to do is just draw land number 4, play out that Great Henge, then play the Edgewall Innkeeper so he can get a little extra value off that card.
Right, he doesn't have any creatures on adventure at this point anyway, so sends it back over to Reid, but the Alrund's Epiphany is sitting there in the foretell zone, and it looks like Reid has a fairly straightforward turn here if he'd like to just fire it off, continue to develop his mana base, get another draw step in there, and then he can follow up with Binding or even Vorinclex if he'd like.
Yeah, so there's a few things few options that Reid has. Reid, of course, has the ability to just play out a Vorinclex. That doesn't end up being great for you because Chris Kvartek has more copies of Brazen Borrower in his deck. So if he runs out the Vorinclex and it gets bounced, that just gives Chris the opportunity to bounce it and then attack in for 6. Chris Kvartek is playing 1 copy of Disdainful Stroke and 2 copies of Negate in the main, so it is far more likely for him to have the bounce effect there, which is why Reid went for the Alrund's Epiphany there instead of the Vorinclex.
Yeah, he's going to run out Binding of the Old Gods here. And while, it's nice to get that 5/5 Lovestruck Beast off the battlefield, the truth is that Reid's not dying to that anytime soon. He just wants to get it off the battlefield to try to prevent this Great Henge from coming down.
Yeah, and this is basically, Chris is just conceding because next turn, Reid has a phenomenal Yorion turn there. He's going to be able to get a land off that Binding the Old Gods, then run out the Yorion, basically flicker the Binding the Old Gods and the Omen of the Sea, and by that point, he's just going to be far too ahead.
Yeah, way too much there for Chris Kvartek to handle. A mulligan there from Kvartek was a little rough, as well as a stumble on mana. But also, Paul, I have to point out that he did end up with the 2 copies of the Great Henge, and the way that he's built his deck, he's much more likely to end up Great Henge flooded. He's decided it's worth it, but there is a downside to playing, extra copies of that legendary artifact there, and we got to see a little glimpse of it there.
Yeah, I mean, I think where the Great Henge really shines, are matchups where your opponents don't have that much counter magic or waste or interact. So as you can see, Chris actually boarded out 3 copies of the Great Henge. So I think he really likes it in the aggressive matchups. It gains you some life and keeps the stream of cards coming. But in this matchup, it looks like Chris wants to just board in and just try to put pressure early and back that up with counter magic. He has, it looks like 6 counter spells in his sideboard.
Ooh. See what Reid brought in here. It looks like he's bringing in his Duresses as well as Extinction Event and an Eliminate. He's already got 1 Extinction Event main as well as 1 Eliminate, so he's just beefing up there. And he's taking out, it looks like Elspeth's Nightmares, a couple of Strokes, Shadow's Verdict. So just some tweaks there.
Yeah, and as you can see, for Chris, he did board out those Great Henges, the 2 Scavenging Oozes, and my guess would be that he brought in the 3 copies of Mystical Dispute, the Disdainful Stroke, and the 2 Negates that he has in his sideboard. So that's a clean swap. Board out the 6 green cards and board in the 6 blue ones.
Yeah, Chris really looking to try to line up just a clean curve here that gives him a reasonable board presence that's worth protecting. Get, say, 5-6 power out there and then just fire off a couple counter spells in the row and the game's over, right? There's only so much Reid can do to try to combat a start like that, but he just needs that really good balance of lands, threats, and ways to keep them alive here if you're sitting in Kvartek's seat, because boy, that was pretty quick. He's already down a game against Reid Duke, and Reid never makes it easy on you. There's no doubt about that. And, he immediately mulliganed and didn't really give us a chance to talk about it there, but that was a perfect example of an unbalanced opening hand there for Kvartek. He had a bunch of counter spells, but no real threats to back it up.
Yeah, and similar situation as game 1. Chris has 2 lands. Really wants to find a 3rd here because he needs to put that pressure on with the Lovestruck Beast here. So really hoping for land number 3, and he got it here. It being tapped is okay because he can just run it out here.
Couple of Kazandu Valleys in a row here. Those are potential threats for Kvartek if he had other lands, but that's just the power of these double-faced lands, is that when you need them to be lands, they're lands. And you can see that double so here early stages of game number 2. There's land number 3 and the Lovestruck Beast follow-up play here. Reid's only answer is going to be an Omen of the Sea, so Lovestruck Beast is going to hit the battlefield.
Yeah, and Reid's sequencing this so that he can go Omen of the Sea this turn. Next turn, depending on what he draws, of course, but next turn he can then go land number 3, Duress, make sure the coast is clear, into Omen of the Sea so that he can set up an Extinction Event on turn 4.
And you can see this game plan that we described earlier starting to play itself out here with Negate in hand here for Kvartek after having 6 power on the board. If he can maintain that, he can just start slamming, take away huge chunks of Reid's life total, and even keep developing a little. But the Brazen Borrower, fine. Another counterspell would be quite nice. Being able to protect against the next 2 spells that Reid casts would probably put Kvartek in a commanding position. The next 1 spell, well, he's going to have to play some magic here.
Yeah, and the Wolf Hill Haven was not a bad draw here because now he can actually just play Duress on turn 4 and just go Wolf Willow Haven into Omen of the Sea and then next turn he just, because he drew the Wolf Willow Haven, he can go duress into extinction event still. So this is going to be big. The question for if you're Chris is, do you want to play around the sweeper, which I think you have to now, because it's not just extinction event that you're concerned about. You're also concerned about Shadow's Verdict because of the Haven. Reid will have access to 5 mana, so I think he's going to keep up this negate. But Reid, of course, we all know that Reid does have the ability to resolve that extinction event because of the duress in his hand.
Yeah, Reid's just playing him like a fiddle here. I mean, he's going to have exactly what he needs, right when he needs it, and the ability to disrupt Chris Kvartek's plan. Now, there's a little bit of a saving grace here, though. Chris does have that Brazen Borrower in hand, so after the dust settles on this, he can still untap with 3 power in the air and keep cracking in. It's something.
Yeah, and if you look at Reid's hand, he does have the extinction event, but he's only really going to be able to get that Lovestruck Beast off the battlefield. Wait, no, actually, after the duress, he might go for even.
He might, because that would strand the Lovestruck Beast. Now, you know, you start to think about cards like the Great Henge, but like you said, the duress shows that he doesn't have it in his hand. And I don't know if Reid's going to assume that Chris is going to have taken a few of those out, but that is actually what happened. So it's pretty unlikely that he finds one.
Yeah, and if I mean, Chris is considering just running out the negate here, but I think you'd rather just let that resolve. If Reid does have a removal spell, Binding the Old Gods or whatever, you want to just continue putting on pressure by hard casting this Brazen Borrower and just keep whittling down Reid's life total.
So now Reid's thinking, okay, what's my game plan going forward? He has perfect information now. There's a Lovestruck Beast on an adventure plus a Mammoth and a Borrower in hand. And Reid's looking at his options. As we mentioned before, he can go for the extinction event after playing a land here. He knows it'll resolve, and he can name either odd or even. It's kind of up to him. If he goes for odd, the beast will be gone, but he'll be taking hits from the 2/1/1s. If he goes for even, well, the beast at least temporarily will be held at bay, but he will be facing down a Brazen Borrower attacks regardless of his choice there.
Yeah, and I think if you're Reid at this point, given that he has nothing else, I think he just wants to stem the bleeding here. I would guess that he might go for even here just to minimize the number of damage the amount of damage he takes. Because if he goes odd here, he's going to take 5. If he goes even, he just takes 3.
That's right. So he's going to go for even. Now, there's a little bit of risk here, and he didn't, at least thus far, hasn't had the bad end of it. But, you know, something like an Edgewall Innkeeper could ratchet that thing right back up to 8 damage coming across. And as you can see, Reid's out of gas here. You know, he might have been considering lining up Yorion for the next turn as well, because he would have had to dump the mana in here and take a huge chunk of damage. He would have taken 10.
Yeah, and Chris here is not really in a position to play around sweepers. He was just kind of considering what he wants to do with the Mammoth. Does he want to play the land? And you know, he just kind of was thinking, you know what? I just need to just hope Reid has nothing. And a key moment here earlier in this game was when Reid went for that Omen of the Sea. And he had 2 heavy hitters that he could choose from. And he chose to bottom both just to try to find more interaction for the early creatures. And now he's just got a bunch of lands. And I bet part of him is wishing that he kept one of those cards on top to be able to try to seal the deal. Now, of course, Reid didn't know what Chris had in his hand. He didn't cast a duress or anything. So, you know, he made the decision that he thought was the best at setting him up. But because he drew a couple of lands in a row, you know, now he's really desperately looking for answers.
Yeah, this is tough too. He just drew his card for the turn, and he didn't find anything with it. He ended up cycling a Triome and finding a Binding, but he couldn't cast it. And this is a big draw here.
Lethal.
It makes it
that was
lethal.
The perfect card.
Wow, Fabled Passage. He could have also found a 1/1. Either way, it would have been lethal. But bang, he gets the job done. Chris Kvartek, he's dancing now, baby. This game went a lot better than game number 1, and he's going to force a game 3 here between Reid and, you know, it's interesting because even though Reid got to enact some of his game plan, we did see some of the clunkiness to the Sultai deck. There are a whole bunch of tap lands. You know, you're trying to cycle away your lands for the cost of 3 mana. I mean, it was slow, and it just kind of let him down. And that was a game where Reid did resolve a sweeper.
Yeah. And one thing to note here, too, is when you're playing against these kind of decks that transform into this aggro control deck, sideboarding also becomes really tricky, because then you start thinking, okay, well, they're going to have counters for my big spells, so I'm going to need to bring in some number of my own counters, right, to maybe fight their counters. Like, how many duresses do I want to bring in? How many negates do I want to keep in? At the same time, they can also put pressure. They can find cards like Lovestruck Beast, so I need to make sure that I have enough removal spells to deal with those threats as well. And finding a good balance is pretty tricky.
Man, Chris Kvartek just looks really pleased with himself down there in the corner. He is just loving that victory. And that's good. You got to celebrate the wins, right? Reid Duke's not going to give you anything for free here. So I like it. Get the confidence level up and run it up.
Oh, and really interesting here. Reid going down to 1 Emergent Ultimatum after sideboard
wow.
here. Yeah. It does make sense if you just look at Chris Kvartek's deck. The fact that he boards up to 9 counterspells means that, good luck resolving your 7-mana card. So,
right. So this is interesting then, right? Because that means that Reid is almost shifting his deck to a more traditional control deck with the Shark Typhoons and then more sweepers and disruption, rather than trying to go over the top as kind of the ramp big finisher deck of the format.
Right.
Okay, well, here's a keep. Ketria Triumph will kick things off for Kvartek once Reid plays his land, since he's on the play. Kvartek cannot wait to get that land onto the battlefield. There it is. Swamp kicks things off here for Duke. How does his hand look? A little slow?
Little slow. He is on the play, though, and the big thing in this matchup, especially because Chris Kvartek sideboards in cards like Mystical Dispute, is just kind of building your mana so you can try your best to fight around that counterspell at least. So, he does have the Shadow's Verdict if Chris gets off to a pretty good start, but he doesn't have a cheap removal spell here to deal with this Edgewall Innkeeper. So next turn, when Chris runs out that Bonecrusher Giant, I mean, unless Reid finds a Heartless Act, Chris is at least going to get 1 card off of this, potentially even more, based on the complexion of his hand.
Yeah, this draw from Kvartek looks fantastic. Just a lot of pressure. He's got 3 colors of mana here. He should be able to deploy most of his threats. And meanwhile, Reid is over here just casting Cultivate.
Yeah. With the Cultivate, Reid will be able to play Shadow's Verdict. But at the end of the day, it's not like Chris is down that many cards, right? I mean, he already got to profit on this Bonecrusher Giant. Reid's just kind of stemming the bleeding here with the Shadow's
Heartless
Verdict.
Act a little late, isn't it, Paul? Guess he'll be happy to have it. One of the things about the Temur Adventures deck, when you're on the other side of it trying to control the threats, is that they do have the Goldspan Dragon you see in hand here for Kvartek, as well as Brazen Borrower, which doesn't technically have haste, but it can hit you on a turn that you pass with an empty board, and it does feel like they're able to keep coming at you with threat after threat. And this hand really kind of illustrates that from Kvartek, as he's trying to take down this game 3 against Reid, who's sort of scrambling to stay alive and has a similar hand to before, where it's some interaction and a lot of lands here from Duke.
All of the lands. I mean, Reid is going to be in some serious trouble here. He's probably going to be incentivized here to Heartless Act the Bonecrusher Giant, being mindful of a potential Great Henge that might be in Chris Kvartek's hand that he doesn't have a counter for. So what you're probably going to see here is Heartless Act and potentially a cycle, or just putting that Yorion into his hand.
Let's see if he goes for Yorion or cycle away the Zagoth Triumph here. It's just going to be Yorion. He wants the guaranteed play, but as you can see, it's a miserable Yorion. I mean, there's nothing even on the board.
Yeah, now we're going to see a Goldspan Dragon here.
Wow.
He's going to be able to make a treasure here, which will allow him to Mystical Dispute this Yorion. And another thing that I want to highlight here, this is one of the big advantages of not playing Obosh in your deck, because you can play Negate, and that interaction with Goldspan Dragon specifically is huge, because you can go Goldspan Dragon, attack, and then still be able to negate or Disdainful Stroke. And those are cards that you don't have access to if you're just playing the Obosh version of the Adventures deck.
Right, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, about the ability to apply pressure to your opponent's life total while also disrupting them. That's the perfect illustration of that. This Goldspan Dragon enabling counter magic even though Kvartek's tapped out.
Yeah, I mean, this is...
Wow, what a beating. Kvartek is really putting it to Reid Duke. And, I got to say here, Paul, when you're on the Sultai side, you always think, okay, well, I could rip an ultimatum here. I can get right back into this. Reid has abandoned that game plan, and it doesn't seem like a Shark Typhoon would get the job done at this point.
Yeah, and Chris actually, knowing that Shark Typhoon could be an option, I mean, he did consider there just letting the Yorion resolve, because he could bounce it potentially as a tempo play with the Brazen Borrower, but actually choosing to play it a little bit more patiently, using the Mystical Dispute, and then keeping the Brazen Borrower up.
And this really kind of shows you where we're at. Reid finds Mazemind Tome, a very slow card, and Chris is like, sure, You got it. Dump a bunch of mana into that to start getting cards back. And by the way, it's more of the same here for Reid. He finds Omen of the Sea off of the Maze Mind Tome. And that's just going to keep that clunky, kind of slow game plan going forward. And unfortunately for Reid, Kvartek's going to just keep slamming on him with this Goldspan Dragon.
Yeah, I think now Chris is just considering whether or not he wants to run out this Borrower. Does he want to just play it out if Reid doesn't have any removal effects this turn?
And the answer is yes to that, Paul. The Brazen Borrower goes on the stack. And it looks like he's going to try to petty theft away the Wolfwillow Haven and then go for the Borrower.
Yeah.
Oh, this didn't work out well. Oh, no. Oh, no.
No.
Reid actually had enough mana to take care of that. That was a big misstep there from Kvartek because, as we know, that counters the Borrower and puts it into the graveyard here. It will not be here to attack.
That was so big because Reid would be at 2 right now.
Wow.
And now this has bought Reid 2 additional turns, right? Because next turn, this Goldspan Dragon isn't lethal. This is going to put him down to 1. He's got an Omen of the Sea, and he has a Maze Mind Tome activation available here, so he could potentially fight through this negate.
Oh boy, old greedy Kvartek. It backfired on him though.
Yeah.
As Reid was able to sacrifice that and reduce the threat count effectively. And that, as you pointed out, Paul, increased the number of turns that Reid gets. And when you have that much mana, and you've got a Maze Mind Tome, and you're resolving Omen of the Sea, you're going to see a lot of cards over that time frame. And as you can see, if he can find a way to deal with this Goldspan Dragon or block it or anything, that could spiral out of control.
Yeah, Shark Typhoon here would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Brazen Borrower is no longer a threat. So the reason, just going back...
Oh, and he even found 2 removal spells off the Omen here, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reasoning behind what Chris did, what he did, of course he missed the Wolfwillow Haven sacrifice line, is just trying to keep Reid off of 3 green mana so that Reid can't play Emergent Ultimatum. That was kind of what was going through his mind. You go, okay, well, I'm going to bounce this because it's free, because I'm going to play this Brazen Borrower anyways, so let's just make sure you can't resolve an Emergent Ultimatum with a Duress backup next turn.
Right.
So this is the fastest negate ever.
Yes.
And the thing, I mean, Chris, Bone Crusher Giant.
Totally.
Goldspan Dragon, right?
Yeah, because you know what it was there's a subtle rules interaction with Wolfwillow Haven. And look at that! Bone Crusher Giant off the top. And Chris says, hey, sometimes you just get there anyway.
Yeah, the question is, when do you fire this off? So Reid, you're going to at least wait for Reid to activate Maze Mind Tome, right?
And or Omen of the Sea, right? It could be both activated here.
Right. But the thing is, I think Reid's probably going to lead with Maze Mind Tome, but you definitely want to wait for Reid to do something here. You don't want him to draw a counter here. This is when you go for it.
And there it is. Bone Crusher Giant, more accurately, Stomp on the stack is going to finish off the match here in favor of Chris Kvartek as Reid gives him the good game. Kvartek escapes with the victory, it must be said. The oversight that he had there, Paul, was Wolfwillow Haven is not anytime you could cast a sorcery, it's only on your turn.